Hey everyone, my name is Tyler Mowry, and welcome to the Writer's Mind Podcast, episode 58. All right, welcome Patreon subscribers to another episode of the Writer's Mind Podcast. So today, I want to talk about I want to talk about a concept called inductive reasoning and what Nassim Taleb considers in this book, Fooled by Randomness, as the problem of induction. So I've talked about this book, of course, before just a couple podcasts ago, but I'm continuing to kind of move through it and kind of go back and look at different chapters and find what was interesting to me and some of the lessons that I'm trying to take from it. And so in what chapter number is this? Let's see. In chapter, give me a second. Chapter 7. So chapter 7 is entitled The Problem of Induction. And first, before we talk about the problem with induction, according to Nassim Taleb, we need to first talk about what is induction, and specifically in the context that this book is talking about, which is inductive reasoning. So inductive reasoning is, in logic, induction refers specifically to the inference of a generalized conclusion from particular instances. In other words, it means forming a generalization based upon what is known or observed. So when we take that, so an example of inductive reasoning would say something like, I've seen 1,000 swans, and every single swan I've ever seen is white, so all swans are white. Or you could say, most swans are white, something like that. That's kind of an example of a baseline inductive reasoning, kind of an example of it. Now, one of the first things, I use this sort of swan analogy here because one of the first things Nassim talks about in this book is, he talks about the Scots philosopher David Hume, and he posed this statement talking about inductive reasoning, which was, no amount of observations of white swans can allow the inference that all swans are white, but the observation of a single black swan is sufficient to refute that conclusion. So, what he is talking about is that initially, he's talking about this idea that a lot of times what human beings like to do is we like to get a single, slice of observable data from our perspective, and then take that to then generalize the larger contexts. And a lot of times that generalization can be mostly true, but not in all instances. And so one of the things that he is refuting or talking back against is certainty, in the sense of people observe a certain pattern in the world or how things are, and then assume based upon that with high levels of certainty that this is how it works in all situations and in all scenarios. And so that is kind of the big thing that he's posing to you in this chapter. And then he starts to look at this in regards to markets and in regards to our understanding of history and in regards to our understanding of predicting what may happen in the future. So soon after this, he talks about, let me find it. So one of the things he talks about is, how people test this, or people try to add this to market situations. And so he says, for example, if somebody says the market never goes down 20% in a given 3-month period. So you can look back in history and say, okay, well, the market has never gone down 20% in a given 3-month period, therefore it doesn't go down. But you can reject this proposition by finding, let's see, what does he say? You can reject this simply because just because the market never went down 20% in any 3-month period doesn't mean that it can't go down in the future. And so one of the things that he says is that a big mistake that people make in regards to predicting the future, in regards to trying to understand history, is they make it so that the craziest thing that happened in the past is the worst it could possibly ever get, right? So you hear this, he says, another logical flaw in this type of historical statement, which is kind of what I'm talking about now, is that often when a large event takes place, you hear it never happened before, as if it needed to be absent from the event's past history for it to be a surprise. So why do we consider the worst case that took place in our own past as the worst possible case? If the past, by bringing surprises, did not resemble the past previous to it, then why should our future resemble our current past? What he's saying here is we have a lot of these assumptions that things don't actually radically change, or that we can't have singular events that change things way more dramatically than they did in the past. And this sort of, people can create this kind of logic and say, oh, in the last 500 years, this is the worst it's ever gotten, whatever that is. So whether that's weather, whether that's, political conflicts or wars or illnesses, whatever, people say, okay, well, this is the worst it's ever been, and it can't possibly get that bad again. But then, of course, if you go to the past previous to that moment, there was something else that would have been considered the worst version of that thing until this new thing happened. And so this seems simple, and this is another thing that he says, is like this, when you lay this concept out to say, of course, the past cannot define how bad or how much change, really. It's not necessarily bad things, it's just how much rapid change could potentially happen in the future. We try to base this on the past. And of course, once we lay this out, we know that, okay, obviously things can be crazier and rapid change can happen faster in the future. It doesn't just have to be based upon what has happened in the past. But then we end up thinking in this way anyways, right? So a great example of this right now is if you are interested in economics at all, if you're interested in, the relationship of government and money and how money works and the foundations of money and this whole thing, what you may hear being tossed around right now is how, because of the pandemic and because of different governments across the world printing money, and because the money printed by governments is not necessarily backed by something else of value. It's more just backed by the fact that we all agree it has value. There's a lot of people saying that we are currently in a position where we could have rapid inflation, and some people are saying that we are currently experiencing rapid inflation, like you could see in the stock market and some real estate prices and used car prices and the certain cost of goods. I think lumber was something that went up crazy, and people are saying that this could continue all the way to the point where our money could become worthless, just like it has happened in certain other nations. I think Venezuela was a recent country that had a massive amount of hyperinflation. I think that's what it was. And so then you have people on the other side kind of saying like, oh, this is overblown. This is not really possible. Like, essentially this kind of like too big to fail idea that the US dollar is used by all these different nations and all of these different peoples agree that it has value, and same with these other major currencies that it doesn't matter how much governments print, that these will remain valuable, and we will just be able to offset this inflation, and everything's going to be fine. And part of this idea is because there never has really been a full-on serious global economic crisis. That would be like, there has been other smaller ones, like for example in 2008, I think the 2008 housing market crash in the US also affected Europe, which affected other elements of the globe. But really, right now, we are the most globalized that we've ever been, and one of the most interconnected that we've ever been. And the world's economy is the most interconnected ever. And that not only that, but we also have the speed of the internet that can also be a catalyst because of the fact that we can exchange currency digitally and buy goods and services digitally. It means that we could actually have a more rapid inflation rate than what we have seen in the past. And we've really never seen a global, a full crash of a global currency, right? Of course, because we've never been here before. And a lot of people are saying, oh, it's not possible, it's not going to happen. Nothing like this has ever happened in history. But just because something this large hasn't happened previously doesn't mean that it can't happen now. Now, at the same time, you can also look at this and say, okay, well, people are always talking about how, some sort of big doomsday event is always coming, right? Like if you watch the news consistently or just, if you even look back at history and see kind of what people thought were going to happen, then people are always assuming the worst. There's always a group of people assuming the worst, and there's a group of people saying it's fine, we're going to be okay. And sometimes it's fine, we're going to be okay, people are right, and sometimes everything is going to go crazy and it's going to be awful. Those people are also sometimes right. But what's interesting is we can see smaller versions of this throughout history, and we can see how inflation affected, regions or continents or, particular empires, and see that, okay, there's a potential of a serious shift. And so just because, the point is that even when we lay things out logically, and we integrate the simplicity of that particular logical statement by itself, that doesn't mean that when we actually get to applying things, or when we actually get to looking at our own minds, we can still find all sorts of illogical thoughts and illogical assumptions and things that we are totally off base on. And we can hold those things in our minds at the same time. We can hold these contradictions, right? So we can believe, okay, of course, things in the future can be worse than they have been in the past. Just because the past has specific extreme scenarios doesn't mean that those are the highest possible extreme scenarios. And then at the same time, we can also hold the idea that everything's going to be fine. Things that look bad right now are not going to get worse. And we can play this game. And so I think also part of this becomes, and this is what's interesting about Nassim Taleb talking about this in regards to markets, is that our world is extremely complex and complicated, and we're also very good at attaching causality to things that aren't actually connected like we think they are. And we like to make simplistic, we like to, and I've talked about this before, we like to create simplistic versions of an idea in our head that we then use to explain our world that aren't necessarily true. And that is also another problem, because we don't actually have access to all of the real information that we possibly need. And that's a big thing I think I've noticed about the internet and current information and the news and all these sorts of things, is that it seems like we have this vast amount of information, when in reality, I think we have a lot of noise and a lot of useless information, and I think it's still very hard to find the actual real important information, and not even necessarily because it's not out there, but because we don't know where to look, because we don't actually understand specific causal chains in a complex global world with billions of people involved doing random things every day, constantly. And I think that what Nassim Taleb is doing in this book is trying to help us get an understanding of the fact that the world is a place of human action that we don't understand, of natural events that we don't understand, and of a lot of people who are not thinking logically, including ourselves. And that because of this, it makes it difficult to figure out what is correct. But having an awareness of these fallacies that we're holding on can also allow ourselves to think harder, or at least take some of our own ego away from trying to figure out what the truth is, or what actually is happening, or what is correct. What's also interesting that he talks about here, especially in markets, is that we like to build situations. This kind of goes back to our negative lines of thinking, is we like to build situations based upon a game, like it's a win or lose situation based upon certain predefined rules. And so he is saying that one of the things that people struggle with when they're in markets and trying to predict what a market is going to do is they assume that it is a win or lose game against the other traders, not necessarily them trying to, figure out this market. And he says that that's another thing that we do wrong, because what this does is it creates more fighting in between people within a game that doesn't actually have predefined rules as we would like them to be. And then this just adds another layer of confusion to our own minds, because not only are we not looking at the problem as clearly as possible, we are now adding another layer of this that doesn't actually exist, which is competition against others to figure out this thing, and then assuming that this has predefined rules, when in reality markets can do anything, and they are full of randomness and things that are difficult to predict, just like life is. And so which is interesting. Nassim Taleb here says he says that that you should not approach anything as a game to win, except of course if it is a game. He said, I also learned to stay away from people of a competitive nature, as they have a tendency to commoditize and reduce the world to categories, like how many papers they publish in a given year, or how they rank in the league tables. And he goes on to say, there is something non-philosophical about investing in one's pride and ego into a house, library, or car, and it is downright foolish to claim to be the first in one's category, all while sitting on a time bomb. And so I think what Nassim Taleb does is trying to help cut through the noise of our ego and assumptions. And that, I think, is one of his biggest values, not only in this book, but in the other books that he has, because that cutting out of the noise of our assumptions and our illogical thinking and our ego can really help us perceive the world in a clearer way, and ideally perceive the problems that come to us as they come, and try our best as clearly as possible to get a sense of what may happen in the future, even as we exist in a world of high levels of randomness. So I hope this podcast was interesting to you today. Definitely check out this book if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys next week.